Today on Histories Tech, we are looking at the origins of the Panzer tank, starting off with the Panzer I and II. Now, when you think of German armor of World War II, the name Panzer is very much synonymous with that. But the Panzer series is a long line of tanks, and there are more famous versions, such as the Panther and the Tiger, are actually later versions of the Panzer. But how did the Germans get to the Panzer? How did they reach this point of development? Well, let's go ahead and look at the origins and history of the Panzer tank and the Panzer I and II. Now, to get started, we've got to look at German tank development during World War I, which, to be perfectly honest, was not really supported by the German military. They kind of saw tanks to be kind of pointless. And it wasn't until the British Mark series of tanks appeared that the Germans actually became enthusiastic about building tanks. And they built the A7V. And there was actually supposed to be 100 of these tanks built, but they only produced about 20 of them. Now, while the A7V was kind of rushed into production, it was actually much faster than any other tank at the time. However, because of its poor off-road capabilities, high center of gravity, it was prone to getting stuck or actually overturning, which made it an easy target. So Germans were known to actually capture the British Mark series tanks and reutilize them during the war. Now, after the war ended, the Germans were forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles, which prohibited the design, manufacture, deployment of tanks within Germany. And so this actually prevented the Germans from developing any sort of future tanks. Now, while the treaty prevented the Germans from actually building tanks and actually going through design them, it didn't prevent them developing tactics. So they actually went ahead and started looking at the future of tank warfare. They worked closely with the Soviet Union to kind of develop concepts. And in 1926, several German companies were basically put forth to develop a few prototype vehicles. Now, they basically called these tractors, but it's pretty obvious when you look at the designs, and it's pretty obvious looking at these that these were tanks. Now, the two designs, the Gross tractor and the Light tractor, literally meaning large tractor and little tractor, were concepts for future types of tanks. Now, 6 of the Gross tractors and 4 of the Light tractors were built, and they were actually sent off to Russia for testing. And their designs kind of gave the Germans the right idea of what they did and didn't want in future tank design. Now, tank development moves forward because of 2 men. One is Oswald Lutz, and the other one is Heinz Guderian. And it's actually Guderian who comes up with the idea of kind of following the British idea of an infantry tank and a cruiser tank, and then adding in a heavy tank to support both of those. Now, by the time the realization comes through that they are going to need to start building these tanks, it's realized that the main tank design that they approved, the Panzer III and the later Panzer IV tanks, are not going to be built in time, so they need a stopgap tank, and that's where the Panzer I and II come in. Now, the Panzer I is actually based on the British Carden Loyd tankette, and it basically borrows the track and suspension and uses German-engineered designs for machine guns. Now, this tank was not designed to be a combat vehicle. The Panzer I was never supposed to go into combat. And this can really be seen in the earliest version of this tank before it even becomes known as the Panzer I, and it's the La S. And this is just basically a Lloyd tankette with a couple of machine guns attached. It has no real protection. Now, when it transitions to the Panzer I, it starts to get better armor plating, increases speed, and actually can carry more ammunition. However, it is really not designed to actually go into the battlefield, and it's actually designed to train the German army how to use the later Panzer III and IV tanks. And so what you have here is a tank that really shouldn't be sent into combat, being utilized really as a training vehicle, and it's eventually going to be placed into war. And it is nowhere near as valuable as its contemporaries at the time. Now, at the time that the Panzer I goes into service, it actually has to go up against the Polish 7TP, the Soviet T-26, and the Renault FT. And all of these tanks are way better than the Panzer I. And the Germans are aware of this. The Panzer I is really a training vehicle that kind of got thrown into warfare. And it's actually going to see its real combat experience during the Spanish Civil War. And it shows basically all the problems that the Panzer I has. Now, the Spanish Civil War teaches the Germans that the Panzer I is really not a combat vehicle, and it is trying to be used as a stopgap measure. So it goes through various variants trying to improve it. And of course, they're trying to provide better armor, better suspension. They really can't do too much in terms of weapon systems because it just can't handle the weight. But they do try to add better guns to it. They even put a flamethrower in it. which came about during the Spanish Civil War, and even self-propelled gun variants of it to try to improve the capabilities of the Panzer I. However, it doesn't take them long to realize they've got to go ahead and field the Panzer II. Now, the Panzer II is designed as an improvement upon the Panzer I, and it actually came into service about 2 years after the Panzer I. And the whole purpose of this was, again, the Panzer III and Panzer IV were not ready for service. The Germans knew they wanted to utilize them, but they couldn't, so they needed another stopgap and one that could actually fight. Now, instead of utilizing just machine guns like the Panzer I's had, it actually was equipped with a 20 millimeter autocannon as an anti-tank gun and better suspension to handle the weight. Additionally, because of the experiences of utilizing the Panzer I during the Spanish Civil War, it was realized that modern tanks needed to be able to protect against armor-piercing shells. So the Panzer II was designed with that in mind. It had much better armor protection than a Panzer I. But as the war progressed, like with everything else, they had to keep improving the design because cannons kept getting better and better. They started utilizing anti-aircraft guns as anti-tank weapons. And so they basically had to try to improve the Panzer until the Panzer IIIs and IVs could be rolled out. With these improvements upon the Panzer I, the Panzer II would be the number one utilized tank during the early days of World War II, especially during the Polish and French campaigns by the Germans. And these tanks really did buy the Germans the time they needed, that by 1940-41, the Panzer III and Panzer IV respectively had been completed and went into production. By then, the Panzer I and Panzer II are going to start being phased out, and eventually they're going to be relegated to backline duty, training purposes. Eventually, they're going to rip the turrets off of both of these and use them as defensive fortifications. Now, similar to the Panzer I, there were quite a few unique variants made of the Panzer II, and these included armored recovery vehicles, transports, amphibious tanks, things like that. But arguably the most famous, or at least useful variants, is going to be that of the self-propelled guns like this, the Wesp. A few other successful designs are going to be like this, the Lux or Lynx, which is actually a light, high-speed version of the Panzer II, or the Panzer II Flamme, which was a flamethrower variant of the Panzer II. Now, even though they were quickly replaced within the early days of World War II, and they really weren't that great of tanks, they were really a stopgap measure, they're actually going to be both utilized past the war. The Panzer I will actually be utilized by the Spanish military until 1954, and Norway had them as a surplus tank into the 1950s as well. Today, both tanks can be found in museums around the world, and you'll actually find a lot of examples of the turrets being on display because many of these had been used as defensive fortifications, and so they were saved after the war. But there you have it, a quick look at the origins of the Panzer tank and the development of the Panzer I and II. Two tanks that were really built as a stopgap measure until a much better tank could be deployed. Because of that, they don't really have the extensive history as some of the other Panzer tanks. However, it really was a part of an evolution for German tank design and is going to eventually influence other tanks as everyone is kind of in this arms race of tanks development that we see during World War II. But that's it for today. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to talking to you on the next time when we discuss the Panzer III and IV.